In the quaint village of Chipping Norton, a glittering harvest dance at Hartley Manor hides a deadly secret. When charming but reckless Tom Ridley is found stabbed on the moonlit terrace, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of jealousy, blackmail, and hidden truths. As suspicions swirl around a wealthy widow, a jealous fiancé, and a watchful spinster, only one question remains. Who struck the fatal blow? Dive into a classic Agatha Christie-style mystery, where every step in the dance leads closer to murder. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Chipping Norton. The late October light filtered through the lace curtains of Raymond West's cottage in Chipping Norton, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak floor. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the window, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of long habit. A skein of pale blue wool rested in her lap, and the faint click of the needles punctuated the stillness of the afternoon. Outside, the village lay serene, its cottages huddled beneath a canopy of golden elms, their leaves drifting lazily to the ground. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn, and the distant chime of the church bell marked the hour. Miss Marple had come to Chipping Norton at Raymond's insistence, a respite from her usual routine. Her nephew, a writer with a penchant for city life, had recently acquired the cottage as a retreat, and he was eager to show it off. "A change of scene, Aunt Jane," he had said, "and a chance to enjoy the countryside." Miss Marple, though fond of her own village, had agreed, sensing that even the quietest places held their own stories. That morning, as she sipped her tea, Raymond entered the sitting-room, brandishing an envelope with an air of mild excitement. "Post for you, Aunt Jane," he said, placing it on the table beside her. The envelope was of fine cream stock, addressed in an elegant looping hand. To Miss Jane Marple, C.O. Raymond West, Willow Cottage, Chipping Norton. The faint scent of lavender clung to it, suggesting a sender of refined taste. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and opened the envelope with care. Inside was an invitation, its text engraved in crisp black ink. "Mrs. Evelyn Hartley requests the pleasure of your company at a harvest dance at Hartley Manor, Saturday, October 15th, at 7 o'clock, it read. A small note in Mrs. Hartley's own hand added, "Do come, Miss Marple. I've heard such intriguing things about you." "Mrs. Hartley," Miss Marple murmured, her pale blue eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "The widow of Mr. George Hartley, I presume. A man of considerable wealth, if memory serves. Textiles, wasn't it?" Raymond nodded, leaning against the mantelpiece. "That's right. Hartley Manor's the grandest house in Chipping Norton. Evelyn Hartley's known for her parties. She likes to play the grande dame, keeping the village entertained. This harvest dance is the talk of the place. Everyone's invited, from the vicar to the blacksmith." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "How very democratic," she said, though her tone held a trace of amusement. "And who, pray, is on the guest list? Such events often bring out interesting combinations." Raymond laughed, accustomed to his aunt's knack for seeing beneath the surface of things. "She enclosed a list," he said, retrieving a sheet of paper from the envelope. "Let's see. There's Gerald Hartley, her stepson, and his fiancée, Clara Weston, Dr. Philip Mason, the local physician, the vicar, Mr. Finch, and his wife, Laura. Oh, and Miss Eliza Gray. A bit of an odd duck, I'm told. Lives alone, keeps to herself. And a few others, local gentry, farmers, that sort." Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, the needles clicking softly as she considered the names. "Gerald Hartley," she said slowly. "I recall hearing of him. A young man with charm but perhaps too much ambition. And Clara Weston. A local girl, I take it?" "From a modest family," Raymond confirmed. "Pretty, by all accounts, but shy. The engagement's recent, and there's talk it's not all smooth sailing. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already weaving connections. She had a way of noticing the small things. Gestures, glances, the pauses in conversation that others overlooked. Villages, she knew, were microcosms of human nature, their inhabitants bound by ties of loyalty, envy, or unspoken grudges. Chipping Norton, with its ivy-clad cottages and ancient church, was no different. A grand event like the Harvest Dance, with its mix of classes and characters, was precisely the sort of occasion where secrets might slip into the open. She glanced out the window, where a boy on a bicycle pedalled past, a bundle of harvest flowers tied to his handlebars. The village was preparing for the dance, its rhythm quickening with anticipation. Yet Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle of unease, the kind that came when her instincts sensed something amiss. "A dance," she said softly, almost to herself. "Such a cheerful word, but it can mask so much. People come together, but they bring their shadows with them." Raymond raised an eyebrow, catching the shift in her tone. "Aunt Jane, you're not suggesting there's something sinister about a village dance, are you?" She smiled, her eyes bright with that quiet wisdom that so often surprised him. "Not at all, dear, but I've found that gatherings, especially grand ones, have a way of stirring things up. Like a stone dropped in a pond. The ripples show you what's beneath." That evening, as she dined with Raymond and his wife Joan, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the invitation. She pictured Hartley Manor, its chandeliers gleaming, its rooms filled with laughter and music. She thought of Mrs. Hartley, a woman widowed yet commanding, and of Gerald and Clara, their engagement perhaps, strained by unseen pressures. And Miss Grey. Why had Raymond called her an odd duck? There was something there, she felt, a thread to be gently pulled. As she retired to her room, Miss Marple opened her small notebook and jotted down the names from the guest list, her neat handwriting filling the page. Beside each, she added a question mark, a reminder that every person was a puzzle, their motives hidden until the right moment revealed them. She closed the book and gazed out at the moonlit village, its rooftops silvered in the quiet night. Tomorrow, at the Harvest Dance, she would watch and listen, as she always did, for the truth had a way of dancing into view if one knew the steps. Chapter 2. The Night of the Dance. The evening of the Harvest Dance descended upon Chipping Norton with a crisp autumn chill, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Hartley Manor stood at the edge of the village, its Georgian facade aglow with the warm light of countless lamps. The gravel drive crunched under the wheels of motor cars and the hooves of horses drawing carriages, as villagers in their finest attire converged upon the grand house. Inside, the ballroom was a spectacle of rustic elegance. Swags of ivy and golden chrysanthemums adorned the walls, their hues echoing the season, while a long oak table bore a feast of harvest bounty, cider jugs, apple tarts, and loaves of crusty bread. A small orchestra, tucked in a corner, filled the air with a lively reel, and the polished floor gleamed under the whirl of dancers. Miss Jane Marple, clad in a simple black gown with a lace shawl draped over her shoulders, took her place in a cushioned chair near the French doors. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, but her hands were still, her keen eyes surveying the room with the quiet attentiveness of one accustomed to observing human nature. She noted the hostess, Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, a woman of striking presence, her auburn hair swept up and her emerald gown catching the candlelight. Mrs. Hartley moved among her guests with practised grace, her smile warm but her eyes watchful, as if measuring the success of her evening. At her side stood her stepson, Gerald Hartley, a tall man in his late 20s, his dark hair slicked back and his evening suit impeccable. Yet there was a restlessness in his movements, a tension in the set of his jaw, as he glanced toward his fiancée, Clara Weston. Clara, a slender girl with delicate features and a cascade of chestnut curls, wore a pale blue dress that seemed to tremble with her nervous energy. She stood near the punch bowl, her fingers twisting the stem of a glass, her eyes darting toward the dancers with an expression Miss Marple found curiously troubled. The room was a tapestry of village life. Dr. Philip Mason, the local physician, a robust man with a hearty laugh, was engaged in animated conversation with the vicar, Mr. Finch, whose mild demeanour contrasted with his wife's, Mrs. Laura Finch, whose pinched lips suggested she found the gaiety excessive. Miss Eliza Gray, a spinster of indeterminate age, hovered near the refreshment table, her plain grey dress blending into the shadows. Her sharp eyes, however, missed nothing, and Miss Marple noted how they lingered on certain guests. Tom Ridley, in particular, a young farmhand with a roguish grin and an easy charm that drew attention. Tom was in fine form, his laughter ringing out as he spun a farmer's daughter across the floor. His tweed jacket was a touch too tight, but his confidence made up for it. Miss Marple observed how his gaze flickered toward Clara Weston, and how Clara, catching his eye, flushed and looked away. Gerald, standing nearby, stiffened, his hand tightening on his glass. Mrs. Hartley, too, seemed to notice, her smile faltering for a moment before she turned to greet another guest. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the undercurrents she sensed. Villages, she knew, were like the surface of a pond, calm to the eye, but teeming with life beneath. A dance like this, with its mix of classes and characters, was a perfect stage for hidden tensions to surface. She recalled the guest list from the invitation, the names now fleshed out by faces and gestures. Gerald and Clara's engagement, she suspected, was not as harmonious as it appeared. Mrs. Hartley's wealth, inherited from her late husband, was a magnet for ambition or resentment. And Miss Gray, her watchful presence suggested she knew more than she revealed. As the orchestra struck up a waltz, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small incident near the punch bowl. Gerald had approached Clara, his voice low but sharp. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," he hissed, his words just audible to Miss Marple's practised ear. Clara's eyes widened, and she murmured a reply, too soft to catch, before turning away. Tom Ridley, passing by, flashed her a wink, and Gerald's face darkened. Miss Marple noted the exchange, filing it away like a stitch in her knitting. The evening wore on, the room growing warmer, the laughter louder. Couples swirled, their shadows dancing on the walls, and the scent of cider mingled with perfume. Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her gaze moving from face to face. Dr. Mason, now dancing with a plump matron, seemed jovial, but his eyes flicked toward the terrace doors, as if expecting something. Mrs. Finch, standing stiffly by her husband, whispered something that made him frown, and Miss Gray, ever observant, slipped quietly toward the edge of the room, her movements almost too deliberate. It was just past 10 o'clock when a piercing scream shattered the music. The orchestra faltered, the violins trailing into discord. The dancers froze, their faces turning toward the French doors, which stood open to the cool night air. Mrs. Hartley, her composure slipping, hurried forward, her skirts rustling. "What's happened?" she called, her voice sharp with alarm. Miss Marple rose, her movements unhurried but purposeful, and followed the crowd that surged toward the terrace. The guests spilled out into the night, their breath visible in the chilly air. Beneath a rose trellis, its blooms faded in the moonlight, lay Tom Ridley, sprawled on the flagstones. His eyes stared blankly at the starry sky, and a dark stain spread across his shirt, pooling beneath him. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, and a woman, Clara, Miss Marple noted, stifled a sob. Dr. Mason pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside the body. His fingers pressed against Tom's wrist, then his neck, before he shook his head. "He's gone," he said grimly, "stabbed, by the look of it." Mrs. Hartley swayed, clutching Gerald's arm. "Who could have done this?" she whispered, her face ashen. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes taking in the scene. The terrace was bordered by a low hedge, beyond which lay the darkened garden. The French doors had been open all evening, allowing guests to drift in and out. Tom's body lay near the edge of the terrace, where the light from the ballroom barely reached. There was no sign of a weapon, only the stark reality of death. As the crowd murmured, their shock giving way to fear, Miss Marple's mind began to work. A single stab wound suggested precision, perhaps anger. The open doors meant anyone could have slipped out, unseen in the bustle of the dance. She glanced at Gerald, whose face was a mask of controlled fury, and at Clara, who stood trembling, her eyes fixed on Tom's lifeless form. Mrs. Hartley's hand still gripped her stepson's arm, and Miss Grey, lingering at the edge of the group, watched with an intensity that Miss Marple found intriguing. The sound of a motor car announced the arrival of the police, and soon Inspector Crane, a tall man with a brisk manner, took charge. He ordered the guests back to the drawing room, his voice cutting through the chaos. Miss Marple followed, her knitting bag in hand, her thoughts already tracing the patterns of the evening. Someone in that crowded, glittering room had stepped out of the dance and into murder. The question, as always, was why and who. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Suspicion. The drawing room of Hartley Manor, so recently alive with music and laughter, now held a sombre hush as the guests huddled in clusters, their faces pale under the chandelier's glow. Inspector Crane stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his sharp eyes scanning the assembled company. The French doors to the terrace remained open, admitting a chill breeze that stirred the curtains and heightened the unease. Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively in a high-backed chair near a corner, her hands folded over her knitting bag, her mild expression belying the keen attention with which she observed the scene. Inspector Crane, a man whose methodical air suggested a preference for facts over fancy, addressed the room with clipped authority. "Nobody leaves until I've spoken with you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "We've a murder on our hands, and the answers are likely in this room. I'll need your movements from 9 o'clock until the scream was heard." Miss Marple noted the reactions. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, seated on a velvet sofa, clutched a handkerchief, her composure strained but intact. Gerald Hartley stood beside her, his hands thrust into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. Clara Weston, perched on the edge of a chair, twisted her fingers nervously, her eyes red-rimmed. Dr. Philip Mason leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his usual joviality replaced by a grim alertness. Miss Eliza Gray, standing apart near a bookcase, seemed almost too still, her sharp features betraying nothing but a faint tightening of her lips. The inspector began with Gerald. "Mr. Hartley, where were you at the time of the murder?" Gerald lifted his head, his voice steady but clipped. "I was dancing with Clara in the ballroom. We'd been together most of the evening." Clara nodded quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's right. We were dancing." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Clara's hesitation, though slight, was telling. A lie, perhaps, or simply nerves. The girl's distress was genuine, but distress could mask many things. Mrs. Hartley was next. "I stepped out to the terrace for a moment, just before 10, she said, her tone measured. "The room was warm, and I needed air. I saw nothing unusual, certainly not Tom Ridley." Dr. Mason, when questioned, confirmed he'd been mingling with guests, though he admitted to stepping near the French doors to speak with a patient about an ailment. "I didn't see Ridley," he said, his voice firm. "I was back inside when the scream came." Miss Gray's account was brief but precise. "I was by the refreshment table," she said, her eyes meeting the inspector's without flinching. "I saw Tom Ridley go out to the terrace alone, perhaps 10 minutes before the scream. I thought he might be meeting someone." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Miss Gray's observation was offered with such certainty. Yet she had not volunteered who Tom might have met. A deliberate omission, or merely caution. Miss Marple made a mental note to explore Miss Grey's role further. As the inspector continued his inquiries, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the crime itself. Tom Ridley's body, sprawled beneath the rose trellis, had borne a single stab wound to the chest. A clean, deliberate strike. The absence of a weapon suggested the killer had taken it with them or hidden it swiftly. The terrace, bordered by a low hedge and accessible from the garden, offered ample opportunity for someone to slip out unnoticed. The open French doors, the swirl of dancers, the dim lighting beyond the ballroom, all conspired to create a moment of invisibility for a determined hand. She glanced at the guests, their faces a study. In varied emotions, fear, shock, and in some cases, calculation. Gerald's tension, Clara's fragility, Mrs. Hartley's guarded poise. Each suggested a story untold. Dr. Mason's alertness hinted at more than professional concern, and Miss Grey's reticence was a puzzle in itself. Miss Marple knew from long experience that murder was rarely random. It grew from the seeds of human passion, jealousy, greed, fear, or shame. The inspector concluded his initial questions and instructed the guests to remain available. As the crowd dispersed, some returning to their homes under police escort, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes drawn to the terrace beyond the doors. Raymond, who had been hovering nearby, approached her. "A grim business, Aunt Jane," he said quietly. "What do you make of it?" She adjusted her shawl, her voice soft but deliberate. "A great deal depends on why Tom Ridley went to the terrace, Raymond. Was he lured there, or did he go of his own accord? And the knife? It's curious, don't you think, that it hasn't been found?" Raymond frowned. "You think the killer hid it? Or discarded it?" she replied. "But not far. There was little time, and a crowd was near. The answer lies in the moments before that scream, in who saw what, and who chose not to see." As they left the manor, Miss Marple's mind sifted through the evening's observations. Tom Ridley, she had learned from snippets of conversation, was a charming but reckless young man, known for his flirtations and his knack for trouble. His attention to Clara Weston had clearly irked Gerald, and Mrs. Hartley's fleeting discomfort at his name suggested a history. Miss Grey's watchfulness, too, hinted at knowledge she had yet to share. And then there was the question of motive. Had Tom's charm crossed into something more dangerous, like blackmail or betrayal? The night air was cold as they walked back to Willow Cottage, the village silent save for the rustle of leaves. Miss Marple's thoughts were far from quiet, however. She pictured the ballroom, the swirl of dancers, the open doors leading to darkness. "It's like a tapestry, Raymond," she said softly. "Each thread seems separate, but pull one, and the pattern emerges. We must find the right thread." Raymond chuckled, though his tone held respect. "You make it sound almost simple, Aunt Jane." Her eyes twinkled faintly in the moonlight. "Not simple, dear, but possible, if one listens carefully. People always tell you more than they mean to." As she retired to her room that night, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added a few lines to her earlier notes. Beside Tom Ridley's name, she wrote, "Why the terrace? Who followed?" Beside Gerald's, she noted jealousy. Clara's name carried the word fearful, and Mrs. Hartley's guarded. Miss Grey's entry was simplest. Knows more. Closing the book, she gazed out at the darkened village, where the lights of Hartley Manor still, burned faintly. The dance was over, but the steps of this mystery were just beginning, and Miss Marple knew she would follow them wherever they led. Chapter 4. Whispers of Motive. The morning after the harvest dance, Chipping Norton awoke to a village transformed by whispers. The news of Tom Ridley's murder spread like frost over the hedgerows, chilling the usual warmth of market day. In the village shop, where Miss Jane Marple sat sipping tea at a small table near the counter, the air buzzed with speculation. The shop, a cosy nook with shelves of tinned goods and jars of homemade jam, was a hub of gossip, and today it thrummed with hushed voices and sidelong glances. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, listened as Mrs. Price, the shopkeeper, recounted the tale to a cluster of customers. "Stabbed, right there on the terrace," she said, her hands busy sorting apples. "Young Tom Ridley, of all people. Never thought he'd come to such an end. Though he was a wild one, wasn't he?" A farmer's wife nodded, her bonnet bobbing. "Always had a wink for the girls, that Tom. And a temper too. I heard he'd had words with Gerald Hartley not 3 days ago, out by the mill." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of polite interest. "Words, you say?" she prompted gently, her voice as unassuming as the grey shawl about her shoulders. "Oh, aye," the farmer's wife replied, warming to her audience. "Something about money, I reckon. Tom was always in debt, gambling, they say. Owed half the county, if you believe the talk." Another customer, a stout woman with a basket of eggs, leaned in. "And he was sweet on Clara Weston, wasn't he? Before she got engaged to Gerald. Made no secret of it either." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. Tom Ridley's reputation was taking shape. A charming rogue, perhaps, but one whose charm had stirred trouble. Gambling debts, a quarrel with Gerald, and an interest in Clara. These were threads worth following. She thanked the women, and finishing her tea, made her way to Hartley Manor, ostensibly to offer condolences to Mrs. Evelyn Hartley. The Manor's drawing-room was quieter now, its festive decorations looking oddly out of place in the morning light. Mrs. Hartley received her with a strange smile, her auburn hair slightly dishevelled, her eyes shadowed. She poured tea from a silver pot, her movements precise but weary. "It's kind of you to call, Miss Marple," she said. "This dreadful business, I scarcely know what to think." Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. "A shock for us all, Mrs. Hartley. Tom Ridley seemed such a lively young man. I understand he was well liked, though perhaps not by everyone." Mrs. Hartley's hand paused on the teapot. "He was charming enough," she said carefully, "but reckless. Gerald thought him a fortune hunter, always sniffing about where money was concerned. I tried to see the best in him, but—" she trailed off, her lips tightening. "And Miss Weston?" Miss Marple asked, her tone soft as a feather. "I noticed she seemed distressed last night. Young love can be so complicated, can't it?" Mrs. Hartley's gaze sharpened, but she answered smoothly. "Clara is a dear girl, but impressionable. Tom had a way of turning heads, and Gerald is protective. It caused some tension, I'll admit." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the widow's words. Mrs. Hartley's guarded tone suggested more than mere disapproval of Tom. Had he been a threat to her, perhaps beyond his flirtations? The Manor, with its wealth and secrets, was a tempting target for a man like Tom, and Mrs. Hartley's composure seemed a fragile shield. Leaving the Manor, Miss Marple strolled through the village, her steps slow but purposeful. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the cobbled lane, and the church bell tolled softly, calling the faithful to a midday service. She encountered Dr. Philip Mason near the surgery, his black bag in hand, his face lined with fatigue. "A terrible thing, Miss Marple," he said, pausing to adjust his hat. "Tom was fit as a fiddle. No reason for him to be lying dead unless someone meant it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Indeed, Doctor. The police haven't found the knife, I hear. That's curious, don't you think?" Dr. Mason frowned. "Curious and inconvenient. A knife like that could be anywhere, tossed in the shrubbery, buried in the garden. The manor grounds are a maze of hiding places. Or closer still," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "A house like that has many corners." The doctor gave her a curious look, but nodded. "True enough. Well, I must be off. Patient's waiting." He tipped his hat and hurried on, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his words. The knife's absence was a puzzle, suggesting either haste or cunning. A killer who fled with the weapon risked discovery. but one who hid it nearby needed knowledge of the manner, or nerve. As she passed the vicarage, Miss Marple caught sight of Mrs. Laura Finch in the garden, clipping roses with a vigour that seemed more angry than attentive. The vicar's wife looked up, her face pinched. "Miss Marple," she said stiffly, "I suppose you're here about that awful business at the manor." "Only passing through," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, "though it's hard to think of anything else. Poor Tom Ridley. Did you know him well?" Mrs. Finch's scissors snipped sharply. "Well enough to know he was trouble, always charming his way into places he didn't belong. The dance was no place for his sort, if you ask me." Miss Marple noted the venom in her voice. "And yet he was invited," she said gently. "Mrs. Hartley seems generous in her hospitality." "Too generous," Mrs. Finch muttered, then caught herself. "I mean, it's not my place to judge, but that boy had a knack for stirring up mischief." Returning to Willow Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched as she sifted through the morning's gleanings. Tom Ridley's gambling debts pointed to financial desperation, a motive that could ensnare others. Gerald, perhaps, if Tom had demanded money to keep a secret, or Mrs. Hartley, whose wealth was a beacon. Clara's distress suggested a personal connection, and Mrs. Finch's disapproval hinted at moral outrage, though whether it was relevant remained unclear. Miss Grey, too, lingered in her thoughts. Her silence at the dance had been as eloquent as speech. Miss Marple opened her notebook, adding new entries. "Tom, debts, quarrels, Clara." Beside Mrs. Hartley she wrote, "Money, secrets," for Clara, caught between two men, and for Mrs. Finch, disapproval, but why so strong? The threads were multiplying, but the pattern was still elusive. She closed the book, her eyes drifting to the window, where the village lay quiet under a gathering dusk. Murder, she knew, was a dance of motives and moments, and she was only beginning to learn its steps. Chapter 5. A nervous confession. The morning sun filtered through the mist that hung over Chipping Norton, softening the outlines of its stone cottages and lending a dreamlike quality to the village. Miss Jane Marple, her black straw hat tilted slightly against the breeze, walked along the lane toward the modest cottage where Clara Weston lived with her widowed mother. The events of the harvest dance lingered in her mind, like a melody half remembered, and she felt that Clara, with her trembling hands and haunted eyes, might hold a key to the puzzle of Tom Ridley's death. Miss Marple's steps were measured, her demeanour as unassuming as ever, but her thoughts were sharp, piecing together the fragments of what she had seen and heard. The Weston cottage was a small, ivy-clad dwelling with a neat garden, its roses still blooming despite the autumn chill. Miss Marple knocked gently, and Mrs. Weston, a frail woman with a worried air, answered the door. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "Do come in. Clara's in the parlour, but she's not herself, poor dear." The parlour was a cosy room, its walls adorned with faded wallpaper and a few framed samplers. Clara sat by the window, her chestnut curls loose about her shoulders, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. Her pale blue dress, so becoming at the dance, was replaced by a plain grey one, and her face bore the marks of sleeplessness. She rose as Miss Marple entered, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Miss Marple," she stammered, I didn't expect you. I thought you might need a visitor, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a lullaby. She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and fixed Clara with a kind but penetrating gaze. "Such a dreadful thing. What happened to Tom Ridley?" "It must have been a terrible shock." Clara's hands, tightened on the handkerchief, and she sank back into her seat. "It was," she whispered. "I can't stop seeing him. Lying there. It's awful." Miss Marple nodded. her expression one of gentle sympathy. Death is always unsettling, especially when it comes so violently. You knew Tom well. I understand. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, her fingers plucking at the fabric in her lap. Not so very well, she said quickly. He was friendly, that's all. We talked sometimes at church or in the village. He liked to joke to make people laugh. But Gerald didn't care for him, did he? Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes missed nothing. The sudden tension in Clara's shoulders, the way her breath caught. No, Clara admitted, her voice barely audible. Gerald thought Tom was too forward. He saw us talking once, and he was angry. But it was nothing, really. Tom was just being Tom. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her needles untouched in her bag. And yet, my dear, you seem troubled. More than one might expect, even for such a tragedy. Did Tom ever confide in you? About his plans, perhaps, or his troubles? Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as if fearing interruption. Then, in a rush, she spoke. He said something odd, a few days before the dance. He told me he was coming into money soon. A lot of money. He called it a deal, but he wouldn't explain. He just smiled, like it was a secret he enjoyed keeping. Miss Marple's mind quickened. Money again. A thread that ran through the gossip about Tom Ridley. Gambling debts, a quarrel with Gerald, and now this hint of a mysterious deal. Was Tom expecting a windfall? Perhaps through less than honest means? Blackmail, she thought, was not out of the question. Did he say anything else? She asked gently. Anything that might hint at who was involved? Clara shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. No, nothing. I didn't want to know, honestly. I told him to stop talking nonsense, but he just laughed. Oh, Miss Marple, I wish I'd never spoken to him at all. Miss Marple reached out, patting Clara's hand. There, my dear, you couldn't have known. But you must tell the police everything, even the smallest detail. It might matter more than you think. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. Clara's nervousness suggested more than grief. It was the fear of someone caught in a web not entirely of their own making. Had Tom's attentions been more serious than Clara admitted? Or had his talk of money stirred unease, perhaps because it touched on something she suspected about Gerald or Mrs. Hartley? The widow's wealth was a constant undercurrent in the village talk, and Tom's reckless nature made him a likely candidate for exploiting it. Miss Marple paused by the village green, where children played among the fallen leaves. She thought of the terrace, the open French doors, the fleeting moment when a knife had found its mark. A single stab, Dr. Mason had said, clean and precise. It spoke of intent, but also of opportunity. Someone who knew the manor's layout. Someone who could move swiftly and unseen. Clara had been with Gerald, or so they claimed. But alibis were fragile things, easily cracked under scrutiny. Back at Willow Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her mind elsewhere. She opened her notebook, adding to her earlier entries. Beside Tom's name, she wrote, "Money, blackmail." Clara's entry now read, "Afraid, hiding something." Gerald's, "Angry, but guilty." Mrs. Hartley's, "Threatened by Tom." And Miss Grey, whose silence at the dance had been so notable, gained a new note. Watching, waiting. She closed the book, her eyes drifting to the window, where the mist was lifting to reveal the village in sharp relief. "It's like a village dance," she murmured to herself. "All movement and grace, but one false step changes everything." Tom Ridley had taken that step, or someone had taken it for him. The question was whose hand had held the knife, and what secret had driven it. Miss Marple knew the answer lay in the tangled relationships of Chipping Norton, and she resolved to unravel them, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 6. The Missing Piece. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of Hartley Manor, casting long shadows across the polished floors where, only 2 nights before, dancers had swirled in carefree abandon. Now the manor felt subdued, its air heavy with the aftermath of tragedy. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, summoned by Inspector Crane, who paced before the fireplace with a furrowed brow. His notebook was open, but his expression betrayed a growing frustration, as if the pieces of Tom Ridley's murder refused to align. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice gruff but tinged with reluctant respect. "You've a reputation for seeing things others miss. I'll be frank, this case is a tangle. No weapon, no clear motive, and too many people with half alibis. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple adjusted her lace shawl, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "You're very kind, Inspector, to think an old woman's observations might help. But I've found that murder, like most human affairs, is a matter of small details. The knife, for instance, its absence is as telling as its presence might have been. Have you searched the manor thoroughly?" Crane nodded, his jaw tight. "Top to bottom. The terrace, the garden, even the shrubbery, nothing but leaves and mud." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze, "you might look closer to home. The manor's kitchen, for example. A busy place during a dance, but not so busy that a knife couldn't be slipped away, or returned." The inspector raised an eyebrow, but something in her calm certainty prompted him to act. He summoned a sous constable and issued brisk orders. "Check the kitchen again, every drawer, every corner. Look for anything out of place." Miss Marple watched as the young officer hurried off, her mind turning over the possibilities. A knife, she knew, was not easily disposed of in a moment of panic. To hide it within the manor suggested familiarity. A servant, perhaps, or someone who knew the house's rhythms. Mrs. Hartley, as mistress of the manor, would know every nook. Gerald, as her stepson, shared that intimacy. Clara, a frequent visitor, might have learned a few secrets. Even Dr. Mason, a regular guest, could navigate the house with ease. And then there was Miss Eliza Gray, who, village gossip had revealed, had once served as housekeeper for Mrs. Hartley's late husband. As she waited, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the night of the dance. The open French doors, the shadowed terrace, the single precise stab wound, all pointed to a crime both planned and impulsive, a paradox that intrigued her. Tom Ridley's talk of money, as Clara had confided, suggested blackmail or a scheme gone wrong. Had he pushed someone too far? Gerald, with his jealous temper, or Mrs. Hartley, guarding her wealth? Or was there another player, unseen in the whirl of the dance? The constable returned, his face flushed with excitement. "Sir," he said, holding up a cloth-wrapped bundle, "found this in the kitchen pantry, tucked behind a stack of linens. It's a carving knife, and there's blood on the blade." A murmur rippled through the room, where Mrs. Hartley, Gerald, and Clara had gathered at the inspector's request. Mrs. Hartley's hand flew to her throat. Gerald's eyes narrowed, and Clara let out a small gasp. Miss Marple observed them all, noting the sudden pallor on Mrs. Hartley's face, the way Gerald's hands clenched, and Clara's trembling lips. The knife's discovery shifted the puzzle, narrowing the field to those with access to the manor's inner workings. Crane examined the knife, its blade gleaming dully under the light. "This changes things," he said. "Only someone familiar with the house could hide it so quickly. Mrs. Hartley, who has access to the pantry?" Mrs. Hartley's voice was steady, though her eyes betrayed unease. "The staff, of course. Cook, the maids, Gerald and I, naturally. Clara's been in the kitchen before, helping with preparations. And Dr. Mason, well, he's often here for tea." Miss Marple's needles now in her hands clicked softly. "And Miss Gray?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild. "I understand she once worked here as housekeeper. She would know the pantry well, wouldn't she?" Mrs. Hartley's lips tightened. "Eliza Gray left years ago, before my husband's death. But yes, she knew the house." The inspector made a note, his expression thoughtful. We'll speak to Miss Grey again, and I'll have this knife tested to confirm the blood is Ridley's." As Crane dismissed, the other's Miss Marple lingered, her mind racing. The knife's hiding place suggested haste, but also cunning. A killer who acted in the moment, yet thought to conceal their weapon. She recalled Miss Grey's words at the dance, her claim of seeing Tom go to the terrace alone. Had she seen more? Her reticence was a thread Miss Marple was eager to pull. That afternoon she called on Miss Grey at her small cottage on the village outskirts. The spinster received her with a guarded politeness, her sharp eyes assessing Miss Marple as they sat in a sparsely furnished parlour. "You're curious about the dance, I suppose," Miss Grey said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "Everyone is." Miss Marple smiled, her demeanour as gentle as ever. "It's a sad business, Miss Grey. You were observant that night, I noticed. You saw Tom Ridley go to the terrace. Did you see who followed him?" Miss Grey's cup paused midway to her lips, her expression unreadable. "I saw someone," she said at last, her voice low. "A figure moving quickly through the doors after Tom, but it was dark and I couldn't be sure who. I didn't want to accuse without proof." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but probing. "A wise choice, but a heavy burden. Secrets can be dangerous, Miss Grey, especially when they protect a killer." Miss Grey's gaze flickered, but she said nothing more. As Miss Marple took her leave, she felt a certainty growing. Miss Grey knew more than she had revealed, perhaps not the killer's name, but a piece of the truth that could unlock the mystery. Back at Willow Cottage, Miss Marple added to her notebook, "Knife, hidden in pantry, insider's knowledge." Beside Miss Grey's name, she wrote, "Saw someone, but who? Protecting or fearing?" The fire crackled as she sat back, her knitting idle. The knife was a tangible clue, but the real answers lay in the human heart, in jealousy, fear, or greed. Tom Ridley's death was a single step in a larger dance, and Miss Marple was determined to follow its rhythm to the end. Chapter 7. The Final Step. The evening shadows stretched long across Hartley Manor's drawing room, where the air held a palpable tension, as if the very walls anticipated the unravelling of secrets. Miss Jane Marple had requested Inspector Crane to gather the key figures: Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, Gerald Hartley, Clara Weston, Dr. Philip Mason, and Miss Eliza Gray, for what she described as a necessary conversation. The inspector, though sceptical of her methods, had come to trust her uncanny insight, and so they sat, a reluctant assembly, their faces etched with varying shades of apprehension, defiance, and curiosity. Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, her slight figure framed by the flickering glow, her lace shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her knitting bag rested on a nearby table, untouched, for her hands were still clasped before her. Her eyes, sharp and kind, moved from one face to another, reading the unspoken, stories in their expressions. "It's a simple matter, really," she began, her voice soft but carrying a quiet authority. "Tom Ridley's death was no accident, nor was it random. He was killed because he knew too much, because he held a secret that threatened someone in this room." A murmur stirred the group. Gerald shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Clara's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Mrs. Hartley's lips parted, but she said nothing, her fingers gripping the arm of her chair. Dr. Mason's brow furrowed, and Miss Grey, standing apart, watched with an intensity that Miss Marple noted with interest. She continued, her tone measured. "Tom was a charming young man, but reckless. He spoke of coming into money, as Miss Weston confided to me. A deal, he called it. Not honest work, I think, but something more dangerous. Blackmail, perhaps. He had a knack for uncovering secrets. And in a village like Chipping Norton, secrets are never far from the surface." She turned to Gerald, her gaze steady. "You, Mr. Hartley, had reason to dislike Tom. He was too attentive to Miss Weston, And there was that quarrel by the mill, wasn't there? I've heard talk of your own troubles. A gambling debt from your time in London, perhaps, or an indiscretion you wished to keep from your fiancée. Tom knew something, didn't he? Something you feared he might reveal. Gerald's face reddened, and he half rose from his chair. That's nonsense. Yes, I argued with him. He was a pest, always hovering around Clara. But I didn't kill him. I was with her, dancing when it happened. Clara nodded faintly, her voice trembling. It's true. We were together. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her focus remained sharp. Perhaps, my dear, but alibis are fragile things, especially in a crowded ballroom with open doors. She turned to Mrs. Hartley, whose composure was fraying, her eyes darting to the inspector. You, Mrs. Hartley, had your own reasons to fear Tom. He was a fortune hunter, as you called him. But was it only his flirtations that troubled you? I think not. Tom had learned something about your late husband's fortune, something that could tarnish your standing. Perhaps he hinted at exposing it, unless you paid him to keep silent. Mrs. Hartley's hand flew to her throat, her voice sharp. That's absurd. I had nothing to do with his death. I was on the terrace for air, nothing more. Miss Marple nodded, as if considering the protest, then turned to Miss Grey. And you, Miss Grey, saw more than you've admitted. You told me you saw a figure follow Tom to the terrace, but you held back the name. I think you suspected who it was, but fear, or loyalty, kept you silent. Miss Grey's lips thinned, her eyes narrowing. I saw what I saw, Miss Marple. A shadow, nothing clear. I won't accuse without certainty. Very wise, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. But certainty comes from piecing together the small things. The knife, for instance, hidden in the pantry, where only someone familiar with the manor could place it so quickly. The terrace, accessible yet private, where a single stab was enough. And Tom's own words about money, suggesting he had pushed someone too far. She paused, letting the silence settle over the room. Then, with a quiet certainty, she turned to Mrs. Hartley. It was you, wasn't it? You followed Tom to the terrace that night. You took the carving knife from the kitchen earlier, perhaps intending only to frighten him. But when he pressed you, demanding money, threatening to reveal that your husband's wealth came from dealings less than lawful, you acted in panic. One swift blow, and you hid the knife in the pantry, knowing the chaos of the dance would cover your steps. Mrs. Hartley's face drained of colour, her hands trembling. No, you can't prove that. Miss Grey stepped forward, her voice low but firm. I saw you, Evelyn. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw you slip out after Tom. You were back in the ballroom moments later, but your face, it was different. Inspector Crane, who had been listening intently, stepped forward, his expression grim. Mrs. Hartley, you'll need to come with me. We'll have more questions at the station. Mrs. Hartley rose, her protests fading to a choked whisper as the constable led her away. The room fell silent, the weight of truth settling over the remaining guests. Gerald's shoulders slumped. Clara buried her face in her hands, and Dr. Mason shook his head, as if in disbelief. Miss Grey stood motionless, her eyes distant. Miss Marple gathered her shawl and turned to Raymond, who had joined her, his face a mix of awe and concern. You were right, Aunt Jane, he said quietly. You always see the pattern. She smiled faintly, her eyes tired but satisfied. It's only a matter of listening, Raymond. People tell their stories in what they say, and what they don't. As they left the manor, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the tragedy. Mrs. Hartley's fear of exposure, Tom's greed, the fleeting moment of violence. It was a dance of human frailty, as predictable as it was sad. She opened her notebook one last time, crossing out the question marks beside Mrs. Hartley's name. The pattern was complete, and the dance, for now, was over. Chapter 8. The Quiet. After the days following Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's arrest settled over Chipping Norton like a soft fog, muffling the village's usual hum with a quiet born of shock and reflection. The harvest dance, once anticipated as a celebration of autumn's bounty, had become a tale to be whispered over teacups and garden fences, its memory tinged with the chill of tragedy. Hartley Manor stood silent, its windows dark, as if mourning the secrets it had failed to keep. Miss Jane Marple, her brief stay in the village drawing to a close, sat by the fire in Raymond West's cottage, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, the pale blue wool forming neat rows in her lap. The village had resumed its routines, but the undercurrents of Tom Ridley's murder lingered. In the shop, at the church, and along the cobbled lanes, Miss Marple caught snatches of conversation, speculation about Mrs. Hartley's motives, pity for Clara Weston, and murmurs of surprise that so genteel a lady could have struck such a blow. Mrs. Hartley, it was said, had confessed at the police station, her composure crumbling under the weight of guilt. Tom Ridley had indeed been pressing her for money, threatening to expose her late husband's questionable business dealings, deals that had funded the manor's opulence. In a moment of desperation, she had taken the knife, intending only to warn him, but fear and anger had guided her hand. Miss Marple, sipping tea as Raymond joined her by the hearth, reflected on the simplicity of it all. "It's always the small things, Raymond," she said, her voice soft but clear. "A word, a glance, a moment of weakness." Mrs. Hartley thought she could silence Tom, but secrets have a way of slipping out, like stitches dropped in knitting. Raymond, stirring his tea, shook his head in wonder. "You saw it all, Aunt Jane. The jealousy, the fear, the hidden motives. I thought Gerald was the obvious culprit with his temper and that quarrel." She smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. Gerald was angry, yes, but his anger was open, like a storm that passes quickly. Mrs. Hartley's fear was quieter, deeper, a current that runs beneath the surface. And Miss Grey, dear Miss Grey, saw just enough to point the way, though she hesitated to speak. Miss Grey, it had emerged, had indeed suspected Mrs. Hartley, but had held back out of lingering loyalty to her former employer. Her testimony, though reluctant, had sealed the case, and Inspector Crane had privately thanked Miss Marple for nudging the truth into the open. Clara Weston, freed from the shadow of suspicion, was slowly mending, though her engagement to Gerald hung in a delicate balance, strained by the revelations of the dance. Dr. Mason, ever practical, had resumed his rounds, and Mrs. Finch, perhaps chastened by her own harsh judgments, spoke less sharply at the vicarage. As Miss Marple packed her things for her return to her own village, she took a final walk through Chipping Norton, her steps slow along the leaf-strewn paths. The church bell tolled, and the scent of wood smoke hung in the air, mingling with the crisp promise of winter. She paused by the green, where children played, their laughter a reminder that life, even after tragedy, found its rhythm again. Yet she knew the village would not forget the harvest dance, nor the lesson that even the grandest gatherings could hide the darkest deeds. Back at the cottage, Raymond helped her with her bags, his expression thoughtful. "You make it seem so clear, Aunt Jane," he said as they waited for the car to the station. "Like a story you've read before." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked out at the village, its rooftops gilded by the setting sun. "People are the same everywhere, my dear," she said. "Their hopes, their fears, their mistakes, they follow the same patterns if you know where to look. A dance, a quarrel, a secret, it's all part of the human tapestry." As the car pulled away, carrying her from Chipping Norton, Miss Marple opened her notebook one last time. She drew a line through the final entries, her neat handwriting a record of truths uncovered. Closing the book, she leaned back, her mind already drifting to other villages, other stories. The dance of human nature, she knew, never truly ended, and she would always be ready to follow its steps.